Hi everyone, my name is Fiona Deutsch and I'm an analyst in the Climate and Environment team at ACCR. And I'd like to welcome you to our webinar today to discuss our shareholder resolutions with Origin Energy. So thank you for joining us. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we're all dialing in from different locations. I live and work on Yagara country, which is based in Brisbane. And I acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. So I'm joined here today by Distinguished Professor of Biology and Deputy Vice-Chancellor of Research Integrity and Development at Macquarie University, Lesley Hughes. Now, Professor Hughes is an ecologist whose main research interest has been the impacts of climate change on species and ecosystems and the implications of climate change for conservation. She is a former lead author in the IPCC's 4th and 5th assessment report, a former federal climate commissioner, and now a councillor with the Climate Council of Australia. In today's presentation, Professor Hughes will discuss the urgent task for decarbonisation and what 1.5 degrees alignment really means. Now, we're also joined by our very own Dan Gocher, ACCR's Director of Climate and Environment, who will discuss a resolution on climate-related lobbying and the gas-fired recovery. Finally, ACCR's National Climate Lead, Harriet Kater, will discuss a resolution on the alignment of capital expenditure. Now, before I pass on to our first speaker, a bit of housekeeping to keep things running smoothly. This webinar is being recorded, which will be uploaded to our YouTube channel within the next 24 hours. If you hover over the bottom of your Zoom screen, you should be able to see a Q&A button. So if you have any questions, please type them in there. And if you could, please let us know who the question is directed to. We're going to have ample time at the end of all the talks today for a robust Q&A session, so please feel free to pop your questions in as they come to mind throughout the presentations today. So without further ado, I will pass on to our first speaker, Distinguished Professor Lesley Hughes.
Thanks very much, Fiona, and good afternoon, everybody. And thanks to ACCR for inviting me to give this talk. I'll just share my screen. So what I'm going to do briefly today is basically unpack the last IPCC report and talk about that in the context of what we need to do to meet the goals of the Paris Climate Agreement, specifically the 1.5 degree goal and the well below 2 degrees goal. And I'll do that in the context of what we need to do here in Australia as citizens and investors. So I'll begin with a little bit about the background to the IPCC and why this particular 6th assessment report is so important. I'll unpack the key messages, then talk about what we need to do in response to those messages. So the latest report from the IPCC was released on the 9th of August. Its tagline is that climate change is widespread, rapid and intensifying. And Antonio Guterres, the head of the UN, described it as code red for humanity. The report was put together by more than 200 authors, more than 78,000 review comments, and as an ex-IPCC author, let me tell you that every single one of those review comments would have been responded to and is available in writing. It has 14,000 citations from the scientific literature and more than 1 million words. So here's the key findings as I interpret them from the summary for policymakers. And the first one is that it's absolutely unequivocal that human activities have warmed the atmosphere, the ocean and the land, and this is causing widespread and rapid changes. And the scale and the pace of this change has almost no precedent that we know of in the Earth's 4.5 billion year history. Atmospheric CO2 is now nearly 50% above pre-industrial levels, largely as the result of burning fossil fuels. It's at its highest level for at least 2 million years that we know about. And the rate of CO2 increase over the past 20 years has been about 100 times the maximum rate that we know of during the last coming out of the last ice age. In addition to the IPCC report, there was a NASA report last June indicating that the amount of heat trapped near the Earth's surface has now doubled since 2005, with the Earth warming far faster than previously expected and the globe is now about 1.2 degrees above pre-industrial levels. So these are graphs from the IPCC report. The first one shows the recent temperature change going back a couple of thousand years. You can see that the Earth was actually cooling over much of that time, but come the Industrial Revolution and the increase of CO2 and other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, warming turned around very, very quickly, and as I said, is now at unprecedented levels. The graph on the right-hand side is basically the graph showing that this can be attributed to human activity. The bottom sort of turquoise-looking lines are what our temperature would look like without human activity. So things like volcanic eruptions and changes in solar sunspots, etc. Whereas the brown band shows what is actually observed, showing that the difference between the observed temperature and what would be expected with simply natural sources of change is accelerating. Our oceans are absorbing, oh, that's got a bit screwed up, I'm sorry. They're absorbing about 93% of the excess heat in the Earth's system. We can now detect warming down to about a depth of 2 kilometres. The oceans are also absorbing a considerable percentage of the extra CO2 going into the atmosphere. That is changing the acidity of the oceans, which are now about 30% more acid on average than they were in pre-industrial times. Important for the context of the 1.5 degree goal is to note that the climate system is not yet in equilibrium. There is more heat going into the oceans, considerably more, than into the land and the atmosphere. Eventually, there will be an equilibration of this temperature. So the warming, a lot of the heat that is currently being absorbed by the oceans will come out of the oceans and be in equilibrium between the atmosphere and the ocean. So there will eventually be a net transfer of heat from the ocean to the atmosphere, which will add to the warming that we experience here on land. Third key finding is, not unexpectedly, that the impacts of this climatic change are accelerating. Here's some of those impacts. We have retreating glaciers all over the world. Some of the world's major glaciers have all but disappeared. This will continue for many, many decades, even after and if we get emissions under control. The water cycle is said to be intensifying. That is, dry areas are getting drier on average, wet areas are getting wetter. And because a warmer atmosphere holds more water and has more energy in it, when it does rain, that rain is tending to come down in more intense events, causing flooding. Here in Australia, the northwest of Australia is getting wetter. The southwest and most of the eastern part of the continent is getting drier, and this includes our major agricultural areas. The intensity, severity of cyclones in both hemispheres is increasing. There is now probably the need to come up with a category 6 to denote the severity of cyclones. Extreme heat and heat waves are also increasing. 2020 was globally the hottest year on record, with the previous 7 years being the hottest 7. In Australia, 2019 was actually our hottest year on record, and Australia is now 1.44 degrees above what it was in 1910 when we started to collect temperature records. Back in 2019, there were 3 times the number of extremely hot days as in any year from the last century. And poor old Penrith in Western Sydney in January 2020 was the hottest place on Earth. The frequency of these extreme events, as shown in this graph, is increasing actually quite sharply, with that last bar being 2019. And there are actually more Australians killed by extreme heat and heat waves than all other weather-related events combined. Looking ahead, the average number of days above 35 degrees in Western Sydney have been modelled to increase by about 5-fold, possibly by 2090, with by the middle of this century, 50-degree days in capital cities such as Melbourne and Sydney becoming relatively common. Coming back to the IPCC report then, it specifies that the rate of ice sheet loss has increased by about fourfold in the previous decade compared to the 90s. And this is contributing with those glaciers and with the warming oceans to an acceleration of sea level rise, with the rate of rise doubling in the period 2006 to 18 compared to the average from the previous 40 years. Bushfire seasons globally are also lengthening and becoming more severe. In some parts of Australia, they've lengthened by about 2 months. This is a map of the world published in August showing the extent of fires just at that time, showing that extensive wildfires were found on pretty much every continent. With 2019 being our hottest year and also being our driest year on record, with rainfall 40% below average, we were set up with the perfect conditions for increased fire danger risk. But in fact, the fire danger risk has been increasing for decades. This map showing what's been happening since the 70s, and the darker brown areas are the areas where the Forest Fire Danger Index has been increasing. This is an index used on a daily basis by emergency services to assess fire risk on that particular day. So the hottest and driest year in 2019 set up the perfect conditions for what's become known as the Black Summer bushfires. Of course, Black Summer is a misnomer because these bushfires started to burn in July in late winter. More than 18 million hectares were burnt. Some estimates put that amount up to 24 million. But 18 million hectares is about 3 times the size of Tasmania. There were enormous impacts, 3,000 homes lost, 34 people died directly in the fires, 3 billion animals killed or displaced, hundreds of excess deaths and extra hospital admissions, with at least a third of the population of Australia affected by smoke. The cost of this disaster is now approaching $100 billion, and it's now known to be the costliest climate-related disaster in Australia's history. Back to the IPCC report then, another finding is that worsening impacts from climate change are essentially baked into the system for at least the next 2 decades. What this means is that the emissions that have already been put into the atmosphere are yet to play out in terms of climate. They will already push temperatures up at least a further 0.2 to 0.6. So that's locked in. So even if we were to stabilise CO2 levels in the atmosphere today and emit no further greenhouse gases, we would still see a temperature rise of between 1.3 to 1.7. What this means is that we're very likely to exceed 1.5 degrees globally in the early 2030s, if not before. And this graph from the IPCC report does show that it depends on which emissions scenario you use as to how much warming we will expect. Even the lowest emissions scenarios get us to 1.5 or above, but the higher emission scenarios give us almost unimaginable warming by the end of this century of up to 5 degrees. Another key finding is that the projected changes in extremes are larger in frequency and intensity with every additional increment of warming. That is, every fraction of a degree is making extreme climate events worse. This is a graph from the report showing the 5 different climate emissions scenarios. You don't have to worry about all of the details here, but I'll just point out this. That under about a mid-range scenario, the national pledges to the Paris Climate Agreement get us, at best estimate, 2.7 degrees. Current policies, and there is a gap between what current policies will achieve and what the pledges are. Current policies under that scenario get us to 3.6 degrees. And of course, the more we go on, the greater the risk of Earth system feedbacks. I'll come back to the feedbacks in a moment. The 6th message is that methane is a very big deal in this report, and it is getting bigger because it's going up so rapidly. In fact, methane, of course, if measured over 20 years, is about 80 times more effective at trapping heat close to the Earth's surface than CO2. So it's a much worse greenhouse gas, molecule for molecule, than CO2. This is a graph from the IPCC report showing that warming caused by methane is now about 2/3 of that caused by CO2. So we hear a lot about CO2. We should really be hearing just as much about methane. Methane emissions have grown very rapidly over the last decade. They're now higher than at any time in the past 800,000 years. And there's been about a more than 150% increase since the Industrial Revolution. The main sources of methane are agriculture and the burning of fossil fuels, particularly the fugitive emissions from gas extraction, which basically puts almost pure methane into the atmosphere directly. Now, I just mentioned before potentially major feedbacks, positive feedbacks to the climate system. We cannot rule these catastrophic events or tipping points out. Here's what some of those might consist of. So going clockwise around these pictures, the Amazon rainforest is being converted from a net sink for carbon to a net source, both from warming and from other anthropogenic activities like setting fires. We are seeing the melting of permafrost, which is also a positive feedback to the climate system. Other major tipping points could be the complete loss of glaciers, the complete loss of polar summer sea ice, particularly in the Arctic. And then there are a whole lot of biological tipping points as well, such as the loss of global coral reefs, which is generally projected to occur by the time global warming gets to 2 degrees. The final key finding is that the window for effective action on climate change is closing rapidly, but it hasn't completely closed. Our climate future is still in our hands. Given that, what do we need to do going forward? Well, you'll all be aware, of course, that the Paris Climate Agreement has an aim to keep global surface temperatures to well below 2 degrees with an aspirational target of keeping them below 1.5. Unfortunately, as I just indicated, current pledges and policies get us to at least 2.7. In fact, the latest UN NDC synthesis report that just came out last month indicates that we would expect a 16% emissions increase by 2030 compared to 2010, and that's where the 2.7 degree estimate actually comes from. So what do we need to do? Well, we can understand what we need to do using the carbon budget technique, which basically is the linear relationship between carbon that goes into the atmosphere and the temperatures that it causes. Because temperature rise is directly proportional to cumulative emissions, with each 1,000 gigatons of carbon dioxide causing about a 0.27 to 0.63 degree increase in warming. The calculations that I'll talk about briefly now come from the Aim High Go Fast report from the Climate Council put out last March. So we can use the carbon budget to ask this question: will we meet the 1.5 degree target? At current emission rates of about 11.5 gigatons per annum, that rate, the carbon budget that we can still afford to spend to stay below 1.5 degrees, will be fully spent in 2.5 years. We would need a 5-fold increase in Paris pledges and their successful implementation to be sure to stay below 1.5. We can use the same calculation for 2 degrees with the same assumptions. For 2 degrees, the carbon budget will be fully spent in 9.5 years, so by about 2030, requiring a 3-fold increase in global Paris pledges. So we know now that we must reduce emissions globally by at least half by 2030 to stay well below 2 degrees, which means we need to get to net zero by 2040 at the latest, which also means that a net zero target, which we hear about a lot, especially at the moment, is about a decade too late. We've waited too long for 2050 to be safe. And what this means as a corollary is that any expansion of fossil fuel development is completely and utterly incompatible with meeting the Paris targets. What about offsets? Well, in brief, carbon from fossil fuels goes in a one-way direction when fossil fuels are burnt. Goes from the crust to the atmosphere. It's additional new carbon. It cannot be offset by land-based carbon because land-based carbon is not permanent. What is grown and drawn down by trees and other vegetation goes back into the atmosphere when that vegetation dies. So land-based offsets, even though they can, promoting forest growth, of course, is great for biodiversity and other reasons, we cannot offset the net flow of new carbon into the atmosphere by those types of offsets. Australia is well known internationally now as a global laggard on climate action. In the UN Sustainable Development Report this year, Australia was scored last out of 193 countries on climate policy and action. Under the Climate Change Performance Index last year, we scored second last to Trump's then America. So the Climate Council has estimated that Australia, to do its fair share, actually has to reduce emissions threefold from current targets, 75% below 2005 levels by 2030, reaching net zero by 2035, with no new expansion of coal, oil or gas. Unfortunately, the federal government, except for this week, of course, has thus far refused to budge on its weak 2030 target. As yet, we have no national net zero target, though it might happen next week. And subsidising fossil fuels and spruiking a gas-led recovery is at complete odds with, as I said, the goals of the agreement. So now we all look forward to COP26 in the first 2 weeks of November. Fortunately, some of our major trading partners and allies are promoting very substantially increased emission reduction targets by 2030, as shown on this slide, including 55% from the EU, 68% from the UK, and 50% from the US. I remind you what the IPCC says is that the benefits of stronger action can be realised within our lifetimes, that is the next 20 to 30 years, with really deep and really rapid emissions reduction. So finally, we are in a climate emergency. It's a fact, not just a slogan. Our physical and biological world is transforming before our very eyes. We don't have much time to turn this around, 10 years at best. Every fraction of a degree matters because every fraction of a degree is doing us harm. Every year that we delay on real action matters. And that means that every choice matters. Climate change is with us because of billions of different choices. We have to start making good choices. Here are the choices illustrated starkly. We can move forward in a renewables-driven environment and economy and keep a lot of those things that we hold dear, or that we can keep going down the same path with 18th century fossil fuel technology, and we will suffer the consequences, but even more so our children and grandchildren. Thank you very much for your attention. I'll leave it there and come back to you.
Thank you, Professor Hughes. That was extremely powerful. Now, if you've just joined us, or perhaps you might have joined us a bit late after the intro, just please note that we're having the Q&A session after all the presentations today. But please feel free to pop your burning questions into the Q&A box down below, and please let us know who the questions are directed to. So now I'll pass on to Dan Gocher, ACCR's Director of Climate and Environment, and he's going to discuss the resolution on climate-related lobbying and the gas-fired recovery.
Thanks, Fiona, and thanks, Professor Hughes, for joining us today. I will share my screen. Okay, so this is Resolution 10E on climate-related lobbying that we've put to Origin Energy for consideration at the upcoming AGM. It is the same wording that has been put to both BHP and South32. Both of those companies' boards have supported the resolution. The Board of Origin is opposed We have highlighted two words there, which we think are the most operative words. The first being strengthening the review of industry associations, and the second being the course of action that we recommend, which is suspension of membership. As you may be aware, Origin suspended membership of QRC last year, so we think it's a viable pathway for the company to take. So just set a bit of history here. This is the resolution that we put to Origin Energy last year. Again, on climate-related lobbying, but specifically related to COVID-19 recovery. It was supported by 25% of shareholders. And it brings us no joy to say that we were dead right about the lobbying that was happening, and the resulting subsidies that have been directed towards the gas industry as a result of that lobbying. So just on shortly after we filed the shareholder resolution, Origin published its 2021 Industry Association Review. That review referred to improvements from APCCR, the Business Council of Australia, and the Queensland Resources Council. Each of them had updated their policy positions. Obviously, the BCA has gone further on the weekend. I wouldn't put that down to Origin Energy's advocacy. However, I would put that down to a bunch of other reasons, which happy to take questions on later. Origin found that it was aligned with its 5 key industry associations and partially aligned with one of them. It didn't find a single non-supportive statement throughout the year with which it disagreed, and it failed to address any of the advocacy relating to the gas-fired recovery, which we believe is the most egregious form of or type of advocacy that we've seen in the last 12 to 18 months. So that's just a screenshot from Origin's review, as you can see, with APCCR. And I know that font is very small, but we will share these slides with you after. Completely aligned with APCCR and completely aligned with the Queensland Resources Council. So these are the influence map scores of Origin's industry associations. D or below is considered misaligned with the Paris Agreement. F is strongly misaligned. I don't think they have an F anymore. I think the Queensland Resources Council was previously an F. It's currently an E negative. So we're not suggesting that all of Origin's industry associations are poor on climate. The Clean Energy Council is obviously the best performer there. The Australian Energy Council has a bit of a middling record, and the Business Council of Australia, while it's still a D there, I suspect if the scoring was done today, it would probably pick up a much better score. And these scores are done over a 3 to 5 year period. So advocacy that groups have undertaken 4 or 5 years ago still matter. And that's obviously was pointed out about the BCA's about face on the weekend. So this is a timeline of the gas-fired recovery. Where are we? May 2020. So March 2020 was the first when COVID really kind of struck Australia. In May, APCCR published a report calling for government assistance to develop uneconomic or stranded gas resources. Later that month, as you may remember, the government formed a National COVID Coordination Commission. It had a manufacturing task force. A report from that task force was promoting the development of multiple new gas basins. APCCR published subsequent reports in September calling for further unleashing new gas development. In September 2020, the federal government announced officially the gas-fired recovery, and at that first instance included $50 million for exploration in the Beetaloo Basin, from which Origin stands to directly benefit. APCCR published another report in late November calling for further government assistance, both in terms of fiscal incentives, fast-tracking development approvals, and so on, to what it said to unleash a new wave of oil and gas developments. In January, Industry Minister Keith Pitt announced $173 million in funding for road development to access exploration in the Beetaloo Basin. And in the federal budget in April, the government announced more than $1 billion in subsidies for blue hydrogen CCS demonstration projects. And subsequent to that, in May, we've seen additional funding to essentially to develop the north. So it's another $111 million in May. to develop the corridor between the Beetaloo Basin and Darwin in order to extract the gas from the Beetaloo Basin. So in our view, it's a fairly straight line between the lobbying by APPIA and the government's gas-fired recovery. And that's a screenshot. It's just a visual representation of that same timeline. So that the reports that APPIA published throughout the year promoting a significant increase in oil and gas development. And these are quotes taken from APPIA's annual report, which came out at the end of 2020, where essentially APPIA takes credit for the government's response to the COVID-19 pandemic and the way that the government talks about gas and the role of gas in the transition. APPIA takes credit for that too. You won't be able to find that annual report online. We had to buy it from ASIC, but I'm happy to share it with you if you're interested. And not to be outdone, the Queensland Resources Council itself had its own resource industry recovery agenda, which it published in the middle of last year. I've highlighted just one item there, which is calling for government subsidies to fund new gas pipelines. So that's $500 million subsidy that the QRC was seeking to develop gas fields in the Bowen and Surat basins. So with this, in short, these are the reasons why we think this resolution is very supportable. The wording is the same as that which has been supported by BHP and South 32 boards. It's pretty clear that Origin's industry associations have sought to exploit the COVID-19 pandemic. The gas-fired recovery is the best example of that. Transparency alone is not going to fix this problem. So despite the fact that Origin has published industry association reviews for several years running, transparency isn't fixing it. So it's pretty clear that lobbying is happening, that Origin is standing to benefit from that lobbying, and the gas-fired recovery is delivered, essentially cash handouts to Origin to fund its development of the Beetaloo Basin. We think the company needs to take action here, and it is a difficult one with APPIA, because unlike other industry associations, there isn't a lot of difference between Origin's position on gas development and APPIA's. They're almost in lockstep. The key difference here is that Origin is saying it supports a 1.5 degree pathway, and that advocacy and the resulting subsidies for oil and gas development are not consistent with that pathway. So when you look at Origin's Industry Association review, it's pretty clear that an assessment of Paris alignment is not part of it. And that's the key gap here. And finally, in our view, to Lesley's point before about the Australian government being a laggard, we think it's this advocacy by Origin and other companies that is the reason for Australia being a laggard, particularly in the way that the government is currently trying to promote the development of further oil and gas resources. And at that, I'll stop sharing and I'll pass over to Harriet.
Thanks, Dan. Quickly, just want to remind anyone to put their questions into the chat below and to let us know who they're directed at.
Yeah, hi. Thank you, Fiona. Lesley, thank you so much for your talk earlier. As Fiona noted, it was incredibly powerful and a really good reminder for why we do the work that we do. I'm joining you from Narragansett country in far southern New South Wales today. And I'm talking to our second resolution that we filed with Origin, Resolution 10F, in which we sought that the company commit to align all material future capital expenditure with the Paris Agreement's objective of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees. And as Lesley highlighted, that is becoming an increasingly difficult challenge. So in Origin's recently updated climate change management approach for 2021, they reiterated their unequivocal support for the Paris Agreement and the agreement's goals of limiting temperature increase to 1.5 degrees. So you might wonder, therefore, why we have filed this resolution. A little bit of context. So firstly, Origin has an existing 2-degree aligned emissions reduction target that was accredited by the Science Based Target Initiative in 2019. It's a problematic target. It wouldn't be accredited today by the SBTi. It accommodates significant emissions growth, which I'll touch on in the following slide. It doesn't include Origin's the Scope 3 emissions from the LNG exports from APLNG, and it more broadly doesn't meet market expectations. As a consequence, Origin has been on the record for some time now, stating that they plan to update their targets to be aligned with a 1.5 degree pathway. It's becoming increasingly unclear if Origin intends to update those targets via the Science Based Target Initiative or using their guidance, or whether they intend on using an alternative method. Recent messaging suggests that they might be pursuing an alternative method. That's something that is of interest to us because, Origin has obtained significant sort of credit from a range of sort of external parties for having that science-based target in place since 2018. So they would be aware of the benefits of having that externally verified target. Also, anyone who's watching the discussion around the Say on Climate vote that's coming up for BHP this year, a key concern that's being expressed, not just by ourselves, but by investors and proxy advisors, is the absence of an external verification of BHP's targets and those targets not being aligned with a 1.5 degree pathway. A key reason why Origin might be looking to split from the Science Based Target Initiative for the update of their target is their oil and gas exploration and appraisal activities, their expansion activities. As Lesley has very clearly highlighted, as also was demonstrated in the IEA's net zero scenario, we cannot have any new oil or gas to limit warming within 1.5 degrees. So therefore, the crux of why we filed this resolution is that Origin may seek to update their target and claim that is 1.5 degree aligned, but it would be very highly misleading for them to not also revise their capital allocation to be 1.5 degree aligned to support that target. So just quickly, the concerns we have with Origin's existing Scope 1 and 2 science-based target. This chart demonstrates Origin's Scope 1 and 2 emissions from FY15 to FY20, showing that the Eraring coal-fired power station, is a dominant source of Scope 1 emissions for Origin. That is scheduled to close in 2032. Which is also aligns with Origin's 50% reduction target for 2032. The problem being that Eraring represents 75% of Origin's emissions, providing them with a 25% overshoot of that target, which allows for emissions growth in other areas of the business. Now turning to Origin's capital expenditure. So this chart shows where Origin is allocating its Capex, or has done so over the past 4 years. Based on the structure of the business and existing assets, it's not surprising that the bulk of that Capex is going towards fossil fuels. You can see that generation sustain for their generation portfolio fluctuates significantly, but can be quite a large source. Again, not surprising for a company that's got a large portfolio of aging generation assets. We want to emphasise that we're not, through filing this resolution, we're not seeking that expenditure cease overnight, as long as those assets are planned to be closed in line with a pathway that's compatible with 1.5 degrees. And we want to emphasise that we're certainly not arguing that, whilst those assets are operating, that Capex should be diverted away that might lead to safety issues in those plants. We've also included the APLNG Capex is reported separately in Origin's annual reporting, but we've merged Origin's share of APLNG Capex in this chart. That includes a share of exploration and appraisal activities that are being undertaken to firm up the feedstock for that LNG plant. And another source that's of particular concern and core to the substance of this resolution is Origin's allocation of Capex to exploration and appraisal activities, which has seen sort of a drop-off in FY21, or all Capex had a drop-off in FY21, predominantly in response to the COVID pandemic and the impact on oil prices. However, FY22 guidance suggests that that's going to jump back up to 85 million again in FY22 as Origin picks up activity in the Canning Basin following its farming with Baru Energy there, as well as ongoing activities in the Beetaloo Basin. So where are Origin's oil and gas interests? And we've titled this slide that these interests are all at odds with a 1.5 degree pathway. And that is primarily because they are projects that have not passed FID within 2021, which the IEA Net Zero report very clearly stated would be unacceptable if they were approved post 2021 to keep within a 1.5 degree pathway. So within WA, Origin has got acreage in the Browse Basin offshore. As mentioned, they've also got recently acquired interest in the Canning Basin onshore, where there is both oil and gas resources. Origin is continuing its activity with its 77.5% interest in 3 permits in the Beetaloo Basin. It is also pursuing activities in the Cooper-Eromanga Basin with 75% interest in 5 permits, and they've also recently acquired 100% interest in another. There's also ongoing exploration and appraisal activities happening across the Surat and Bowen Basin for feedstock for APLNG. So the 3 sort of new basins or areas where Origin is pursuing gas is the Beetaloo, Canning and Cooper-Eromanga in particular. These are all onshore gas plays. As Lesley highlighted, methane from onshore gas extraction is a particularly problematic source of emissions and something that warrants significant consideration and reduction between now and 2030. Origin's view is that, you know, they recognise that there are climate considerations for their pursuit of these projects. It is their view that there are sort of pathways available to them to green this gas over time, including carbon capture and storage and the use of offsets. Unfortunately, this is not actually the case and certainly not consistent with a credible commitment to 1.5 degrees. So again, Lesley alluded to the fact that offsets simply are not providing the sort of permanent reduction in carbon that we absolutely and urgently need to be able to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. They are not a solution to justify ongoing oil and gas expansion. This has been noted by the Science Based Target Initiative for some time. They don't accept offsets as a method for meeting science-based targets. They have recently refreshed their messaging on the use of nature-based solutions, emphasising again that corporate funding for nature-based solutions should not be used to avoid or delay action to reduce emissions from fossil fuels within a company's operations or supply chain. The SBTI are also updating, releasing for the first time a standard for meeting net zero targets, which is highly needed considering the extremely broad interpretation of what a net zero pathway is. And I would say that is particularly the case in the oil and gas sector. So that standard is coming out in late October. What we do know is that there will be a very strong emphasis on a highly limited use of offsets for meeting net zero targets, particularly with particular focus on the role of offsets within oil and gas companies, where they really dominate those strategies. Similarly, CCS is not a solution and not an excuse to expand oil and gas production. The technology itself has proven to be expensive, has a long track record of failure. It does not address all emissions from oil and gas projects, particularly fugitive methane emissions, which, as mentioned, are highly problematic, and also has proven to be really difficult for post-combustion emissions. And also that the assumptions around, there are assumptions around the use of CCS in the IPCC and IEA 1.5 pathways, but these are not associated with oil and gas expansion. As Malte Meinhausen, an IPCC lead author, states, in order to achieve the Paris Agreement targets, in particular 1.5 degrees, we absolutely do need CCS, but not in combination with fossil fuels. And what he means there is that the only CCS that we can justifiably use to meet 1.5 is direct air capture, which is a highly expensive and sort of early stage technology where we are actually sucking significant carbon from the atmosphere, not capturing it at point source on industrial facilities, sucking it from the atmosphere and ideally burying it permanently underground. It's pretty clear that, to credibly set a 1.5 degree pathway, Origin has to transition away from gas and gas expansion. And we're not the only party that's saying this and noting this. In the World Benchmarking Alliance Oil and Gas Benchmark that was released this year for the first time. So this is a collaboration between CDP and the French government agency using the ACT carbon transition assessment methodologies. They very clearly say that Origin has to clarify how they're going to transition away from gas. through a detailed low carbon transition plan to demonstrate climate leadership. So Origin's response to our resolution, seeking that they align Capex to a 1.5 degree pathway, they have recommended against our resolution, citing that they are progressing their work towards their 1.5 degree pathway and are aiming to be net zero by 2050 solely for scope 1 and 2 emissions, which will be problematic. And I know that will be a key focus in the SBTI's net zero guidance as well. They also stated that they're continuing to review their capital allocation as part of the emissions reduction target updates. That is certainly something to watch. And if it's not clear already, we have grave concerns about them seeking to have their cake and eat it too by stating they have a 1.5 degree target and still pursuing those gas exploration and appraisal activities. They also state that because they've committed to providing their shareholders with a say on climate vote in at the 2022 AGM, that supporting this resolution is not justified. We unsurprisingly disagree. We see our ask being entirely consistent with Origin's commitment to update their targets to be 1.5 degree aligned. There is no harm in supporting this resolution today as a consequence. As highlighted, oil and gas expansion, even with offsets and CCS, is not compatible with 1.5 degrees. If you don't want to listen to me, you can ask our resident scientist, Lesley, to validate that statement. So what we have sought here is entirely consistent with investor expectations and what the CA100 Plus is seeking around alignment of Capex in their net zero company benchmark. In fact, the language of this resolution was drawn from the capital allocation benchmark for the CA100. And finally, we see supporting this resolution as being entirely complementary to the 2022 Say on Climate vote, by providing investors with an opportunity to communicate their expectations to Origin in advance of them setting their climate transition plan, increases the probability of Origin releasing a plan that is truly 1.5 degree aligned, saving everybody time in this really critical decade and giving Origin license to get on with transitioning their business. Thank you.
Thank you, Harriet. So now we'll move on to the Q&A portion of the webinar, and just a quick reminder to pop any questions in the Q&A section below. I'll get us started. The first question is to Professor Hughes. What would you say to investors who have companies telling them that new oil and gas projects can be consistent with limiting warming to 1.5 degrees?
Well, the statement is just at odds with all of the science that we know. We know we have to reduce, the carbon budget tells us we have to reduce emissions from existing sources by 50% at least by 2030. And so we can't do that, meet those goals, plus add new sources of emissions. It's just entirely illogical. So the carbon budget analysis absolutely supports what the IEA said and various other organisations. We cannot afford any new oil, gas or coal expansion and hope to meet the Paris climate goals. Impossible.
Thank you, Professor Hughes. We'll go on to a question about lobbying. If Origin is deriving benefits from an APPIA membership, why should they change anything?
Great question, Fiona. Look, I think if there are benefits, and look, we're not saying there's not, but those benefits are in short-term nature only. Like climate, the risk of developing, particularly the Beetaloo Basin, as well as the other basins that the government has flagged through the gas-fired recovery, poses a much greater, longer-term risk to both Origin, its shareholders, and the broader community than does the very short-term benefit of, cash handouts for exploration that Origin might be getting, and that's reflective in the long-term share price performance of Origin as well.
Okay, and then follow-up question to that: what can be done to limit APPIA's influence on Australia's politics?
That's a great question. I ask myself that every day. I think we need more investors speaking out about the influence of groups like APPIA and their role in pushing the gas-fired recovery. When COVID first struck, investors were out there saying that we need that government spending in order to encourage growth following the pandemic should be, clean or green, and we should, build back better was the phrase. And that seems to have died down now. And now the government just seems to be getting away with pushing a gas-fired recovery. So we need investors speaking out. We need other companies who are, who don't have an interest in oil and gas extraction or coal extraction for that matter, becoming far more vocal in this debate.
Thanks, Jan. I got another question for Professor Hughes. You've highlighted that limiting warming to 1.5 degrees is a huge challenge. What might that mean for companies setting targets that aim to align with 1.5 degrees? Is it a reason for decreased ambition?
No, I mean, the locked in temperature means that we'll very, very likely overshoot 1.5 degrees, at least, in the early 2030s. And what we've got to work very hard to do is to bring that temperature back. So have that overshoot, which will almost inevitably occur as short a time period as possible, and haul it back before we get close to 2 degrees, which, when you consider what has happened to the world, including Australia, at 1.2 degrees above pre-industrial, even getting to 2 degrees or higher, to 3 degrees, it is almost unimaginable in terms of the impacts that we would all have to cope with. So we have to, all of us and all companies and all investors have to work to ensure that that inevitable, almost inevitable 1.5 degrees overshoot is brought back as soon as possible in the next few decades, to move into a safer climate operating space for humanity and everything else by the middle of the century. Things will get worse before they get better, but we cannot afford for those worsening impacts to keep accelerating.
Absolutely. Okay, next question is on capital alignment. What do you expect Origin to do? Write off all oil and gas assets tomorrow?
Thank you, Fiona. No, that is not our ask, but we do think Origin needs to make a choice and make some pretty hard calls here. We've made it clear that they can't continue claiming that they will align themselves with 1.5 degrees if they don't materially revise their corporate strategy and their capital allocation accordingly. And I would argue that, unlike some of the pure play oil and gas companies, Origin has got more options. They are an electricity retailer. Electrification is going to be a huge opportunity and is hugely necessary for decarbonising our economy. And similarly, they have experience in electricity generation. So, as I say, we're not asking for immediate write-off, but we are seeking a pretty swift revisitation of their strategy. And if they're not willing to change their strategy, then they just need to cease making claims that they can align themselves with a 1.5 degree trajectory.
I guess that's a good follow-on to a follow-up question. Isn't Origin already closing its coal and gas generation in line with 1.5 degree pathway?
So the IEA Net Zero report stated that for coal generation in OECD countries needed to be closed by no later than 2030. The current closure date for Eraring is 2032, so ideally it would be a bit earlier. State of the energy market is such that it quite possibly will be earlier. It's a pretty live discussion at the moment. In Origin's scenario analysis of their generation portfolio, they state that their gas generators will predominantly be closed by the mid-2030s, which isn't too far off what is required. However, then when you look at what AEMO lists as the sort of planned closure dates for those assets, it states that it's more likely out into the 2040s. Some of the larger units will be closer to mid-2040s. So that is definitely something to kind of keep an eye on and raise with Origin.
Thanks, Harriet. We've got another question. Have you considered that the significant risks of higher oil and gas prices causing the push cost inflation threaten equity markets through lower margins and ultimately higher discount rates? As fiduciaries, we need to manage our member wealth foremost. Throw that.
Take that one, Dan.
I assume that means higher share prices for oil and gas companies, and that's currently not playing out with Origin. I think the weight of the electricity generation business is weighing down any perceived benefit it might get from a spike in oil and gas prices. But I'd argue that any spike is probably temporary anyway. Prior to this, perceived crisis, we had a glut of oil and gas, and now, months later, just due to a confluence of very strange events, both a low wind in Europe, a warm summer, a cold spring, supply issues with coal, and in China due to flooding caused by climate. It's a very unusual series of events that has led to this particular moment in time. But as we know, climate poses a much bigger risk to members of super funds in the long term than does missing out on any kind of short-term benefit from being invested, or that short-term return from being invested in companies. And we're not suggesting that the super funds divest from these companies anyway. We want them to remain invested and actually use their weight to shift them into cleaner technologies.
Okay, thanks, Dan. So we've run out of time today for any further questions, but I just want to thank our panel, and in particular, Professor Hughes, for joining us today. If you have any further questions, please reach out and contact us. Our details are on our website, and as I mentioned, this webinar will be posted to YouTube. So thank you everyone for joining us.